The finale of Superman and Lois ended the series true to what it has always been, a beautiful, moving, mixed bag that still has some shortcomings inherent to being a CW show, but outshines those fumbling shortcomings with its strengths as a family drama take on the mythos of Superman. Hi, I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. So I'm going to give my thoughts on the finale of Superman and Lois, and also take the opportunity to talk about the series as a whole, reflecting back on my viewing of it over the last 4 years or so. The finale, first in terms of story, script, pacing, tone, finale to start with. It wraps up the Doomsday and Luthor problem using the unique concept for this version of Doomsday for a surprisingly emotional moment, as it had already been done before. I love this concept of Doomsday. I don't prefer it over the comic book concept, but what they do with this version of Doomsday allows for some types of story beats, some emotional moments that you would never get with a Doomsday story. And so I like how it came to an end here. The final confrontation with Luthor has some dialogue that felt artificial, but the fight itself yielded an iconic near still slow motion image that I think should be made into a poster. In general, the episode was a great mix of the usual ambitious for CW action bursts and emotional family drama. So a very fitting ending to the series in that regard. There is some evidence in the finale, I think, of the abbreviated season, the budget cuts that were necessary as they finished out the show, in the fact that there were a few things that felt crammed into the episode, tying up loose threads, I suppose. But in my mind, I'm like, you guys didn't need to tie up these loose threads. I personally was not interested in those threads, but I understand why they felt the need to do that. But it did mean that there were some moments that they wanted to include, some types of moments, some dramatic beats, some culminations of things that, or types of moments they wanted to have to close out the series, but they couldn't create a proper build-up for. They would have needed maybe one more episode to flesh a few lines out to really feel like they were earned in this last episode. And so this made several of them fall flat for me. And I would have preferred, as I said, that they just remove some of those beats in favor of others getting proper attention. The ending gets surprisingly spiritual, without spoiling anything by saying more, or at least very philosophical, as a monologue about the meaning of life caps off the final moments over kind of a montage of some visuals. The content of those words fell a bit short and didn't hit center target every time, but much of it still resonated and is very compatible with what we as Christians would say is important in life and what life is largely about. The things that they would say are the ultimates in life, I would say, that's falling short a bit. But I mean, apart from some of those little nitpicks, it's like there's a lot here that we can agree with as Christians. And so it was philosophically satisfying in a number of ways, also emotionally moving to see the imagery with which those values were portrayed. Again, no spoilers regarding details, but instead of leaving much room for a miniseries or a TV movie in the future, I was kind of hoping that maybe they'd leave room so that, you know, after James Gunn gets plenty of time to establish his DC universe, we could come back and revisit these characters and where they're at. I think there's still room for that, but they are clearly trying to cap off the timeline by telling us in this episode how Lois and Clark lived out the rest of their lives. And with the show's perspective so much related to what spouses and parents are thinking about in their middle-aged years, including, from my own experience, speculation about our aging lives, should we live that long. This is just a time of life where you're thinking about those kinds of things. And so to have that briefly represented is like, okay, what happened in the years following this with Clark and Lois? How did their lives play out? It was great to see that as a closeout to the series, even though at first I wasn't sure how I felt about their choice to do that. Now, talking about the series as a whole, in terms of just the script, tone, pacing, all those kinds of things, the writing of this show, for my money, is stronger than any CW superhero show before it. I don't think that's a huge bar, being set. But I mean, since they are a CW show, I think it was probably a big achievement for them to be as polished and elevated, in my view, above other CW DC superhero shows as they were. Although the show detours now and then to give too much time, in my opinion, to supporting cast members like John Henry and Natalie Irons, or Lana's family and marriage, or even slightly more peripheral characters outside of those folks. You know, I could have done with less of that and for it to stay more focused throughout. The further away it gets from the title characters, I think the weaker the show was. But those detours never derailed the show completely for me. They just yielded a few episodes out of its entire run that I watched peripherally while playing a video game. The norm for the series was pretty solid writing that put Clark and Lois in these intensified versions of very relatable family challenges, showing them not as these perfect, all-wise parents, this perfect family that handles everything right, but parents, family members, who usually knew the right decision to make, or at least held the right ideals that should have resulted in the right decisions, but in the moment, as we all do, failed to make those right decisions. But then in the fallout after those moments, they give each other grace, they forgive each other, they love and support each other in ways that help them heal from those fractures and rebuild trust and relationships after the fallout of those problems temporarily created a break between them. The show was never about, will this family fall apart? Will this marriage fall apart? And I love that they committed to that from the get-go. That's so often what stories are about, like, oh, will they get divorced or won't they? That was never on the table. And knowing from the beginning that that was the intent of the showrunners, yielded, I think, much more interesting types of struggles when you know, okay, the question isn't, are they going to give up? The question is, what's life going to be like with this problem until they've dealt with it? What are they going to need to endure in order to repair this break between them? How does a truly loving family endure and work through challenges brought to them externally with their own internal shortcomings in the mix? And of course, all that with frequent bursts of superhero action. The series also created fresh takes on characters like Steel, Bizarro Superman, which I hate in the comics in almost every iteration, but this version of Bizarro I actually appreciated, and it worked for me. It was not silly for me. Doomsday has, as I mentioned earlier, a very different kind of concept and origin. Lex Luthor, a different vibe to him that eventually does kind of shift around to some things that, you know, we would see as more iconic and traditional versions of Lex Luthor, but still the road to get there, the background, the vibe of that character, it was a worthwhile kind of variation. Even though sometimes I was like, that's not working for me. Most times I was like, I'm open to this, and I think this is interesting. And there were even brief nods to alternate versions of Brainiac and a little bit of Darkseid lore in the last season. And all of these things largely worked for me as a longtime DC Comics fan. And of course, the rest of the show worked for me really well. Also, I think a big part of that, though, was because I'm in my mid-40s, as Superman and Lois are in this story. I am happily married, also to a fair-skinned brunette. I have 2 teenage boys. And so there was a lot in this that I could relate to, just given my situation, my stage of life. And I mean, hey, what dad wouldn't like to feel like they can relate to Superman and live that fantasy a little bit? Like when the character that I look at this family, like the one that I relate to most, also happens to be Superman, hey, that's pretty cool, you know? Yeah. Anyway, there's like specific moments related to him being Superman and his family and what his boys think of him that I'm just like, oh man, I would love to have that kind of moment with my boys, you know. Anyway. Okay, so cast and performances. I'll just talk, I guess, mostly broadly about the series as a whole with this. The cast performances, I feel like throughout the show are a mixed bag, and they're strongest when the script is really at its best, and when there are nonverbal acting opportunities for the actors to work with, that give them time, that favor them by giving them some room to breathe. TV shows can't always afford that, and so when they did, which was fairly frequently, it really brought out the strengths of the core performers. But this sometimes doesn't happen, and that results in some moments that do feel to me forced and artificial. And the final episode, unfortunately, has still some examples of that. Tyler, I'm going to pronounce these actors' names wrong. Tyler Hoechlin isn't quite the ideal Superman to me in his look, but it's still a close enough to kind of I guess what I subconsciously have in my mind is like the look for Superman. But his Clark Kent, his performance now, I'm talking about, is probably my favorite next to Christopher Reeve. He's got a little bumbling nerd that he does as a show that's part of masking his identity. But he's also genuinely kind of a cheesy and traditional guy, and he takes delight in things that others would be jaded and scoff at. And he's humorously cheery when others are jaded. It's a nice take on Clark that makes Clark kind of 1/3 an act and 2/3 the truth of who Clark really is, and what makes him a genuinely good guy. Now, I didn't have this in my notes to start with, but it just occurred to me I should comment on the glasses. I do think, and this is more of a writing comment than an acting comment, I think that there's a big missed opportunity with the glasses. They lean on the glasses as the thing that keeps people from knowing who Superman is. And most people today think that's a ridiculous concept, and I've shared that view in the past. But when you understand the origins of the character of Superman and how the idea was that there's a sad truth in reality that people are overlooked and unconsidered because of superficialities about them. When actually, if people would get to know them and who they are beneath those superficialities, they would discover that there's a lot more to this person worth getting to know than you might think. And that metaphor has been so lost in so many presentations of Superman. Very quickly, I think it was lost and not taken advantage of as much as it could have been. I think we see it some in the Christopher Reeve performance. Certainly the contrast is there, but I don't know that it's necessarily a big-time metaphor about people, overlook this nerd. He's underappreciated for who he truly is. I think it is the ultimate geek fantasy to have a character who is underappreciated, overlooked because of superficialities, but has this opportunity where people see who he is underneath really shine through and be respected and valued. And it's funny to me how they lean on the glasses, and they don't do it in a way that's jokey. They really take it seriously, but they don't ever quite convey to me as an audience member why I should take it seriously. They lean into it so earnestly that it's hard to kind of scoff at it, but at the same time, in the back of my mind, I'm like, yeah, but why? And I think if they would, in the writing, bring that metaphor to the forefront, on a meta level, we as an audience would not only accept that because of the metaphor and what it's saying, what it's communicating, but we would appreciate it. I'm really hoping that James Gunn understands this about Superman and brings that into his version of Superman. We'll see in a few months. Anyway, so missed opportunity there in the whole run of this series, even though it was really leaned into as a topic, as an idea. Really big missed opportunity there. But that said, coming back to performances, I think that Tyler Hoechlin really is a solid Superman, an even stronger Clark Kent, and I was at the end of the day, satisfied with what he brought to the show. Elizabeth Tulloch is one of my favorite Lois Lanes now, probably ranking her just below my favorite, that being Amy Adams of the Snyder movies. She is charming, and I don't know, Amy Adams might be tied with what's her gal, Margot Kidder. Some things about Margot Kidder, I'm like, oh, that's my number one Lois. Sometimes no, that bumps her way down. So my feelings about her are inconsistent, but she's somewhere in that territory for sure in my mind. And Tulloch is charming and portrays Lois as a loving wife that is both supporter and counselor to Clark. They are very much partners. They each have strengths and weaknesses that complement each other so well, and you see that as they are wrestling through problems. And when they disagree on things because of their strengths and weaknesses as characters, and the way that that brings them to a compromise, the performances support that so well. And Tulloch, I think, probably has the most intense emotional performance moments, I should say, in the show, given to her in the script, and she carries them off very well. So very satisfied with the two leads in this show. The actors playing their sons, Jonathan and Jordan, felt fairly solid and sometimes gave powerful emotional performances, but other times they didn't feel genuine to me. The mid-series recasting of Jonathan was jarring at first, but the new actor, probably more than any actor replacement I've ever kind of experienced as a viewer, the new actor settled in really quickly to this role, feeling like a genuine continuation of the same actor. I felt early on like, man, he must have really been studying some mannerisms, some ways of delivering dialogue. I don't know what it is, but there's just some things about him where he's kind of like, quote unquote, channeling the original actor's performance. And so I was a bit surprised at how quickly I kind of settled into accepting him, and now I think it's going to feel strange in some ways for me to go back and watch the original actor when I do. Now I'm almost certain I'm going to butcher her name. Emmanuelle Chriqui? I don't know. She plays Lana and was a great presence in the show and had some wonderful performance moments of her own, very emotive performance moments. She was a great extension to the Kent family. Yeah, I don't have much more to say, although she was a major part of the show, but I really appreciated her presence and just the dynamic that her character brought. The rest of the supporting actors were less frequently convincing to me. They retained some of that CW vibe that feels like a director told them to smile and look suave rather than it truly being an emotive performance moment. That's not necessarily a knock on them. A lot of that can be just how the show is run, the shooting schedule, the directing style and stuff. I mean, there's actors that I have seen in CW contexts that are much stronger in other contexts. So, but unfortunately, that was where a lot of the CW vibe kind of came from, is some in the supporting cast performances. They all had their strong moments for sure, but more often felt less real to me than the core performers. Okay, stunts and visuals. I really liked the suit. I'm surprised at how dark it goes in its color palette. In some ways, I think it's more muted and dark than like Man of Steel even was. I'd have to see them, side by side. But I mean, it certainly has like a very dark, grayed out kind of look to it that I certainly don't mind. But I wonder what like other Superman fans think, who maybe thought the Snyder Superman suit was a little too dark and muted or whatever. What I don't like about the suit was that it, in some cases, seemed obviously padded. And I don't think that is necessary, except because of maybe a preconception on the showrunner's parts that Superman has to have a certain bulkiness to him. I understand that, with Snyder's, with Henry Cavill's Superman being so bulked up compared to previous Supermans, that maybe they felt like it would be too much of a difference to not have him a little closer to that. But, Tyler Hoechlin is like, has a way better physique than I'm ever going to have. I mean, remotely. I think his build is probably closer to Christopher Reeve's build. And I think with modern costuming, they could mold it and so that it would actually show that the detail, the definition would come through more without having to add padding to it. But it definitely seemed like there was padding involved. Now, plenty of shots, it wasn't distracting, I didn't notice it, but there would be shots now and then just because of how the actor is moving in the suit that like it shows some of the weaknesses and reveals some of the weaknesses of how the costume is made. So that was sometimes a shortcoming of the show, but thankfully most of the time it wasn't distracting, just something I noticed now and then. The CGI, the effects, the stunts, all that kind of stuff, I would say is not premium CGI compared to like what the best of Netflix, the best of Apple TV Plus or HBO Max, or something like that, the best of what you're going to see on some of those really premium channels. But it is better than I would expect from a CW show. And I would say that from beginning to end. But Doomsday's entrance to the story marked what I think was a heightened ambition that almost reached Batman versus Superman levels in some moments. Where I was like, man, I feel like they really said, okay, we've got to do justice to this, because it hasn't been that long since we saw Doomsday done with a full budget and lots of visual polish in theaters, and so we've really got to up the ante, and I feel like they did. But it still felt short in other moments. I mean, in its best moments, it was coming close to the Snyder version. But it fell short in a number of others. But to come that close is a huge compliment, especially for a CW show. So I can't wait to watch this show on Blu-ray to consistently see the great detail and polish that streaming, just by nature, now and then pixelates. The camera work from beginning to end of the run of the series really tries to give some cinematic shot composition compared to other CW shows. I could see that in the pilot episode and appreciated that it carried on. It wasn't just something they gave a lot of effort to the pilot for. No, they continued to have some establishing shots, different things that really were trying to create something kind of cinematic. And as they leaned into slow-mo epic imagery later in the series and some of like the action sequences, man, it cranked things up another notch. So definitely some flaws, definitely some shortcomings, but very ambitious and sometimes, pulling off some really nice things to look at. So in the grand scheme of things, I don't think I have any real complaints for the effects, and certainly have some compliments. Just briefly, I'll talk about the music, the sound. I'm hoping that the Blu-ray experience will allow them to kind of bring some things, some dynamic contrast to the home theater in a way that streaming the show couldn't. But I don't really have any complaints in that department. I'm just kind of hoping that there's more for me to experience. The Superman and Lois theme, bum ba dum ba ba da. I mean, it's its own animal, and it speaks not just of Superman, but I think it speaks of Superman and Lois and a life lived nobly, lived enduringly. It's not just a Superman theme. It functions as that sometimes in some superhero moments or the aftermath, some grand moments, some grand Superman-specific moments. But it functions so well in just representing the drama of the whole family being Superman's family, and just the marriage, the challenges of being a parent, all those things. It's beautiful, and so I've appreciated that theme. I've never commented on it before, but I want to touch on that briefly. Okay, so themes though, what's going on in this show that could trigger some worthwhile thought or conversation? Well, the final episode touches on some great values like commitment to family, and how this life is so largely about loving relationships of various kinds, not just romantic. Not everyone is coupled up at the end completely, although the ideal of the traditional family is still presented as valuable. There's a powerful moment of forgiveness that took me off guard emotionally, largely due to a guest performer going in an emotional direction that I wouldn't have expected, but was very welcome. And I was like, oh man, I'm getting the feels here. Some great values were really propped up and given a spotlight in the last episode. But the series as a whole, my gosh, there's so many themes relevant to the common struggles of families. Parent-child relationships, husband-wife dynamics in relationship, grandparents and adult-child to adult-parent, relationships, sorting through baggage from childhood as adults now. Coming-of-age teen stuff. Thankfully, that is not the lion's share. There's plenty of that in other CW shows, so I was glad that it took a backseat to these other things. In rare cases, it does dip philosophically into kind of like liberal values, but most times it's dealing with these things in a way that we can agree with as Christians and propping up values that we can agree with as believers. I hope to convince my wife and boys to watch this show with me, because I think it will remind us of our love and our commitment to each other. So very valuable in that regard, I think. All right, no idea what your tastes are in TV shows, but if I were a time traveler, at the end of it all, I'd go back in time and say, Peter, man, buy the entire run of this show. Get it on Blu-ray, get that nice 1080p clarity, get that true quality home theater sound, ditch the forced commercials, ditch that CW watermark, get those things out of there. Watch this show, get it in your collection, and see it in the best possible way it can be presented. This show, even with its significant, fumbling CW flaws, deserves to be in your collection and be viewed under the best quality circumstances, hopefully with your family the second time around. This show is as a whole rated TV PG. I think that's pretty much for violence, language, and subject matter. And those are all of my thoughts for now on Superman and Lois, the series finale, and the series as a whole. As always, I'd love to get your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. Have you tried this show? Are you thinking about it? Are you a longtime fan? What were your thoughts on how it ended? Please like, share, subscribe, click that bell to stay connected. I want to thank the Spirit Blade Insiders for making so much of my content possible. You can get info about the benefits of joining over at patreon.com/spiritbladeproductions. Then I hope you'll check out our podcast and stay connected to all CGC content over at christiangeekcentral.com as we continue to geek out and seek the truth. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.